Hello, and welcome to Staying Global While Staying Home. I'm Lucy NewComm, the CEO of the NewComm Global Group, global business from the inside out. With me today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Deborah Elms, Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center based in Singapore. Hi, Deborah, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, as our viewers know, we generally talk about navigating the pandemic and from different business leaders, workarounds, and what we might say hacks here in Silicon Valley points of view. But today, we're so honored to have Deborah's particular set of expertise working to create bridges of, I'd say, bridges of effectiveness between governments and the private sector. And there's been a particularly burgeoning free agreements scenario in the Asian region. So Deborah, would you like to just talk a little bit about the newer ones that have occurred and kind of how you see RCEP and CPTPP evolving, along with anything else you'd like to talk about? It just seems very, do you think it's pandemic related, or is that my imagination?
Well, we've always had a strong impulse towards economic integration in Asia. These are governments that have been export-led for decades, that see the importance of keeping trade lanes open. And COVID has accelerated that enthusiasm by many of the governments in this region, because they recognized under COVID that if you are disconnected from the larger markets, globally or even regionally, that creates all kinds of economic pain and damage. So many governments in this region that had already been fairly strong supporters of economic integration have now seized on various kinds of trade arrangements as a path out of the pandemic. So as a way for them to recapture economic growth, promote economic development, especially by many of the smaller firms that have been hit so hard by COVID closures and pandemic related restrictions in and around the region. I know that many of your viewers are likely to be in the United States, where COVID may feel like a long ago thing. But here in Asia, many of the governments have only very recently started to lift some draconian restrictions. I mean, we pay attention a lot to what's happening in Shanghai and China, but the rest of Asia has been similarly shut down for quite some period of time.
Right. Is there one or two particular free trade agreements, like we've said, there are quite a few lately, that you see particularly accelerated at this time? We have the new US framework we can talk about. DEPA, the whole digitization of agreements beyond free trade, but especially in free trade, seems to also be accelerated by the pandemic. Where do you see the pandemic sort of being a lever for some of these things?
I think two, maybe three of the alphabet soup of agreements that we have in Asia are particularly important for companies. The most relevant one is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, because if you're a company, that agreement gives you benefits. I keep saying to firms, if you come and you ask me how to use this, we can find you markets, we can lower your costs, but you will be able, regardless of whether you produce widgets or you're a software engineer or you're whatever you are, there are benefits to be had in the CPTPP. So that agreement is useful and it's expanding. At the end of this year, fingers crossed, we will have the UK joining the CPTPP, and we have a line of countries that have already put up their hand to join as soon as possible, including China and Taiwan. Ecuador, we're waiting on an invitation coming in from Korea. So there are a number of new important governments that are keen to join the CPTPP. While that's been going on, we have a similar type of comprehensive trade agreement that brings together 15 markets here in Asia, all 10 members of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, with China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, called RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And I apologize ahead of time for so many acronyms. RCEP came into force at the beginning of this year for 12 economies, and we are waiting for the last 3 to be part of the agreement by the end of this year. RCEP also delivers benefits for businesses. Some of them are less dazzling in the first year, what will become more important over time. Some of them are important today, especially for services and investment, which is accelerating in and around the region. And governments have latched onto RCEP as a mechanism to help pull them out of COVID economic slumps for many of the countries in this region that have struggled. And then we have, as you just noted, a number of digital agreements that are also worth paying attention to. We have two different types. We have one broader agreement that is much more cooperative called DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. It's in the news this week because the Canadians put their hands up to join. So it's Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. Korea is in the middle of accession talks. The Canadians put their hands up this week. The Chinese have asked to join. So DEPA, I think, is a very interesting agreement to keep an eye on. In terms of delivering business benefits, it's a little less helpful, at least now, because many of the commitments by governments are to cooperate. And while a business can, I'm sure, understand why cooperation is better than not cooperating, it doesn't really deliver the kind of bottom line impact to your business that you might get from a CPTPP. Still important. But there is a different kind of trade agreement on digital that does seem to provide more benefits for businesses called the Digital Economy Agreement, DEA. Singapore has been signing a lot of these with the Australians, the Koreans, the UK, a couple of more are under negotiation. Those have some more significant benefits for firms in areas like electronic payments, discussions on electronic invoicing, digital identity, artificial intelligence. So there are some really interesting new innovations taking place in trying to coordinate, I would say, I was going to say harmonize, but that's not right. It's actually coordinate our policies around different digital approaches. And I think that is crucial because if we're not careful, we will end up with regulatory fragmentation. And businesses that want to scale up around the region will have to contend with different rules on all kinds of digitally relevant provisions around privacy, data hosting, data transfer mechanisms, et cetera. And so the idea behind these digital economy agreements is to try to ensure alignment by the participants so that it makes it easier for businesses to do business in the digital space.
Terrific. And I would imagine that was somewhat pandemic driven, if not pandemic accelerated, just the way all the e-commerce scenarios have been. And yet I don't hear, just because of the nature of trade agreements, I don't think any of these are a flash in the pan. Do you?
No, I think that these are, again, they're important. In the past, we knew that digital mattered, obviously. Governments understood that, but I don't think that they personally experienced it to the same extent as they have over the last 2 years of the pandemic, which has really focused attention by policymakers on why digital matters and on why difficulties in doing business online matters to both customers and to businesses. So they've been much more enthusiastic post-COVID about thinking around, again, payment systems, for example, which when we first started raising this issue a couple of years ago in the RCEP negotiations, many of the government officials were like, but payment is not an issue. Like, I can pay for stuff. That's not a problem. Partly because, of course, government officials by definition are elites, and many of them have bank accounts and credit cards, and many of those processes worked, but it's increasingly difficult to get interoperable payment systems when you switch borders. So when you travel, you may discover that certain kinds of payments don't work unless you pre-authorize them. And even if you have pre-authorized them, they may not work. Many of the mobile wallets that are increasingly spreading around this region do not work in multiple markets, even if it's for the same company. So there are some real challenges that government officials personally experienced. And when they personally experience a problem, they tend to be more motivated to fix it. And so I think COVID has accelerated much of the focus on digital, and especially around removing unnecessary impediments to the flow of digital goods and services. And I think that is extremely important because the pandemic has certainly illustrated to all of us that if you're not online, you will struggle. So you can still do offline business, but you also need an online component or a digital component to your business in order for you to be successful going forward.
That makes perfect sense. And it's almost like electronic payments are becoming standardized more around the world, where in the US, we've been doing them for a while, as you know. And it's almost like, I would want to say the silver lining of the pandemic, but perhaps an unanticipated consequence is giving more opportunity to have this kind of digital transformation go on in the payment space that will ultimately benefit consumers, won't it?
It makes a huge difference. Having the ability to use payment systems, especially cross-border, because I care most about trade, makes a difference in facilitating transactions. If you are a customer, whether you're a business or a consumer, and you're trying to buy something online, goods or services, and you get to the end of that process and you discover that your payment system doesn't work, you have to abandon whatever you were doing. And that's a missed opportunity for that business that was trying to sell those goods and services. So payments seems, for many government officials, especially, like an uninteresting part of the global economy, but it's fundamental to
Agreed.
helping facilitate businesses. If you can't get paid for what you do, then you can't be a business. So,
Right.
we've been trying to make this message resonate for governments in this region for a long time, and it was challenging until COVID. And then COVID hit, and suddenly a lot of governments were trying to buy things themselves from different markets, and discovering that actually it's harder than they thought to manage, especially cross-border payments. So, what might work in my government, my jurisdiction, my country may not work in a different one. And then why is that? Or I have to pay an extra high fee, or the merchant won't accept it, or, we had all sorts of challenges. And the situation with payments, of course, is reflected in lots of other areas where firms suddenly tried to export, discovered all kinds of customs paperwork problems, tariff rates that were different, tax issues that they didn't anticipate. And so I think, again, as we move to become more regional and global, you need to sort out some of those unnecessary frictions in order to facilitate trade, especially, and I think this for me is key, for the smallest companies, because they simply cannot afford any more difficulties in doing business.
Absolutely. And actually, as you're talking about, sort of unanticipated consequences throughout, it would seem like this could also be part of maybe a tangential factor, but also part of the supply chain issue in some cases.
Yeah, so the supply chain, yes, it's a bit of an issue. I mean, the supply chain stickiness and challenges that we have had in managing the supply chain has also, for Asia certainly, reinforced the need to have trade agreements in place that help lower the risk and increase the certainty that trade will in fact continue to move. So I think that the pandemic has not only focused our attention on digital, but also on why these kinds of trade arrangements can make a big difference, because the last thing you need at a time of challenging supply chain logistics is unnecessary challenges at the border. You need to have clearance as quickly as possible. You need to have paperwork that can be submitted ahead of time and online. You need to have, because one of the big obstacles we faced early in COVID is that most of that physical paper that accompanies a shipment went by air while the shipment was at sea. And so when we started the pandemic and we had border closures on air, especially passenger arrivals, the belly of that aircraft is often full of cargo. And one of the most important things we discovered is the paperwork goes often by passenger jet to accompany shipments by sea. And so if the paperwork can't get through, then the shipment can't get cleared. And so that was a very early, very significant problem for an awful lot of logistics companies who scrambled to figure out, well, how can they get the papers, the physical paper, which is frankly a mountain of documents that you need in order to ship a container, from where it is to where it needs to be in time for that cargo to be offloaded seamlessly and then distributed where it needs to go. That has, again, accelerated the movement towards, thankfully, digital delivery of such papers and allowing firms to input that information online rather than having to have physical sheets of paper moving around the world. Although we still have way too much paper in the system at the moment, at least we've got attention now focused on why this is a problem.
That's amazing, isn't it? And we probably would have carried on doing that kind of bifurcation insanity for, pardon my judgment,
for a very long time.
Sounds like. Absolutely. If we hadn't had the pandemic, not that I'm wishing that happened, but certainly there's a revelation in that. Wow, thanks for sharing. That's a really amazing anecdote.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've had a number of trade processes. The problem is that trade processes are unsexy, right? Yes. Nobody really wants to roll up their sleeves and spend political capital on addressing things like how we handle letters of credit which have been unchanged for literally hundreds of years.
True.
And
Yeah.
so this sounds very uninteresting until you have a crisis where you can't get the physical piece of paper from where it is to you in order to open up the line of credit, in order to actually finance the transaction. And so finally, I mean, again, I don't want a crisis, but the good news about this crisis is it did start to push that conversation that has been bubbling away forever to the front lines. And people actually said, let's do something about it. Why do we keep discussing this problem and not solving it? Let's actually address it. And finally, we're starting to get to where you can address it.
Thank you for that. And not only in Asia, I bet. I mean, obviously that's your purview, but I would imagine that like letters of credit are worldwide, and probably some of these other areas that Asia might have even, you know, sort of led the way in resolving some of them, because that's where it seems to have shown up. But these are ultimately some worldwide problems.
They are a major problem. They impede trade and transactions and businesses going across borders everywhere. And Asia has been at the cutting edge of moving many processes, especially for the clearance of goods, online. So we have these single windows in and around Asia that are supposed to streamline this process. And we have many Asian governments that have been very successful, including, say, Singapore and Korea, in creating companies that now deliver that expertise to other governments so that they can also start to go online and digitize some of this customs clearance processes that are incredibly expensive, very time consuming, and limit the amount of trade that happens. And so again, useful, we've already had that underway, but the COVID just reminded everybody, like, this is not some kind of uninteresting problem. This is genuinely one of the reasons why firms struggle to export or to import.
Right, and it sounds like also to support what you've been, a drum that you've been trying to bang, it moves this whole conversation from kind of nice to have technology to absolutely must have technology and processes.
Exactly, exactly. And without these systems in place, then obviously we're not going to get the outcomes we're looking for. And so fortunately, as a happy coincidence as well, much of the technology has now evolved to the point where you can go online and you can move a lot of these transactions into the digital realm, where for a while there was skepticism about the ability of electronic platforms to deliver especially securely, reliably, safely, et cetera. But now many of those concerns, I think, are being mitigated, and that also helps. So the tech has finally caught up with the idea. And then we've had the pandemic sort of give you an incentive for delivering on this long-standing discussion and actually turning many of these discussions into reality.
Well, we talk about innovation being driven by constraint, and certainly the pandemic has introduced numerous constraints and hopefully some really viable innovations like the ones you're talking about. So I want you to know I did not install a heater underneath your chair in Singapore, but to put you in a slightly hotter seat, I believe that in the three primary trade agreements you just mentioned, RCEP, CPTPP, and DEPA, if I heard you correctly, and I'm just wondering what your take is about this, again, recognizing this could be a challenging question, I believe I heard you talk about China wanting to enter all three of these agreements. Is that correct?
China's already in RCEP. China has applied to join both CPTPP and DEPA. So China is recognizing, like many governments in Asia, that integration is key to their future success. And they have applied to join several different agreements and have been negotiating more bilateral deals as well to make sure that those trade lanes remain open for Chinese companies, Chinese investors, and that China remains relatively, I note that one in quotes, but relatively open to the other side coming into China as well.
That was my next question. So you see that one of the positive things from this could be at least technically a bilateral scenario.
Yeah, we have bilaterals also going alongside of these regional agreements. We have a lot of bilateral commitments. Again, this is a part of the world here in Asia that sees the value and importance in integration, and that puts economic ties generally ahead of security and politics. So I've always said to people that in Asia, it's sort of economics on top and then security politics much further down. That is the inverse of the way the US tends to view things. So that's a bit complicated. But because economics really has dominated for so long, you see governments saying, even though it may be politically challenging, even though there could be security aspects attached to this, we need to prioritize those economic linkages, and we will sign agreements or engage in negotiations or have arrangements, even with governments with whom we may not see completely eye to eye, because ultimately our economic survival depends on our ability to connect to others, whoever those others are. And if you have major markets, then you must be connected to those major markets or you're going to have problems.
Right. It's interesting. I want to ask you to comment on the recent US framework proposed, but it is interesting how one can observe the attempts to prioritize economics and others make other priorities and kind of try to navigate around varying things.
It's the US approach on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, is a challenge for some governments in this region, in part because it's been framed as an anti-China strategy by Washington. And when you make it an anti-China strategy, you make it very difficult for potential IPEF members to join, because at the end of the day, China remains the largest market for exports and imports for every single government in Asia, much more than they are connected to the American market. And so when you say, I want you to sign an agreement that is explicitly against our largest trading partner, you can imagine that causes a lot of heartburn for potential IPEF members. And it's one of the reasons why the United States had some difficulties in getting participation in the IPEF statement that they made this last week.
Well, you know, I always think being for something has so much more power in it anyway than being against something. Do you, you know, there's sort of obvious reasons why people could be for it, but I hear you completely. That was sort of my subtle question leading up, and I'm glad you just addressed it with candor. I mean, are there positive reasons? Again, this is the generic across the board question. Are there reasons they would want to sign irrespective of the China issue? Does it offer benefits, really?
Well, it's unclear because it's despite months of gestation, it remains pretty underspecified. So it's not exactly clear what potential members will do and what potential members will get out of it. I think there is space for new kinds of conversations. The one that I think has the most promise, or the part that I think has the most promise, is a climate pillar or a climate discussion, because what we are missing, despite lots of conversations on climate and how we address climate change, is the connection between climate and trade. 100%. So there will be rules that come out of the climate side that will have trade implications, and we don't have a place or a forum or a body that can address those connections. So let me just give you one example. Many governments are enthusiastic about having border taxes for carbon to make sure that if I charge a different price for carbon domestically, that you foreigners do not sneak in without having to pay the same price, because otherwise my firms will be uncompetitive. So the solution to this is, let's put up a tax at the border that deals with carbon. But that obviously has trade implications, because if my economy is structured quite differently from yours, if we don't tax carbon at the same rate, if we don't input carbon at the same rate, then my firms are going to be at a huge disadvantage coming into your market, and potentially the reverse. So there are real trade implications attached to these carbon border adjustment taxes that have really not been explored. And I think that there is space for a conversation about border taxes, about remanufactured goods, about reused goods. Those remanufacturing and reuse of goods is something that's obviously important for climate reasons, but the trade rules tend to not allow easy movement of remanufactured or recycled or repurposed or reused goods. They get put in a separate category, they get treated very differently, they may be banned outright. And so we have to, I think, discuss, how do we make trade rules that deal with remanufacturing, reuse of all kinds of different things, recycling in general, those rules are not in place in trade. And so I can imagine that there would be a lot of enthusiasm, in fact, for discussions around these issues as well. So I think climate and trade is an area where it is ripe, in my view, for a conversation between the largest group of countries that are prepared to discuss, well, what are we going to do about that? We may not be ready to make rules on it yet, because it's a little early days, but we need to have the conversations, that we need to have the discussion and the dialogue about what are the options, what is the problem we're trying to solve, what are the potential solutions on the horizon, and then create sort of win-win or cooperative outcomes to address many of those challenges.
That sounds really important. I'm sorry, I'm reflecting on what you're saying, and that sounds really important. And like you said, they've been siloed for far too long, and I think we're seeing this with climate in a number of sectors. But trade has got to be a critical integration point. And so thank you for mentioning that. And you think the US agreement can be a lever for that?
There's the potential for that. I mean, one of the US pillars is around clean, green decarbonization. There's a lot of things, whatever the title is, I think it's currently called clean. So there's potential for that conversation to take place. I think for me, a bit of a challenge is that it's part of this overarching framework. That framework, as we mentioned earlier, has been pitched as a China containment strategy already. So trying to get a climate and trade discussion in that framework, in this strategy, I think could be harder than it needs to be. I mean, frankly, if you want to deal with the climate and trade nexus, you have to have China in. You've got to have a
100%.
Conversation with China, because of course they matter in this space. And I think, to be honest, I think they would have been very enthusiastic about participating in that area, because it matters. And they are, in some cases, showing leadership, and in some cases, not necessarily showing leadership, but willing to discuss that. But once you park it into this larger framework, obviously the Chinese are not going to join this larger anti-China framework. So that makes that pillar harder to deliver than it might otherwise have been. I think, at least.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And even then, I mean, I asked you the question, do you see a benefit, a for case, since we have an against case? And that the climate response was really compelling. But that is a long game also, even if we got everybody to line up. I mean, technically it's not a long game, because, you know, the sky is falling, so to speak, but businesses, et cetera, will still look at it as a long game. And so
yes, yeah, no, there are no, given the structure and given the approach the United States is taking, there aren't a lot, I would think, of short-term obvious wins, especially of the sort that the business community will like. So let me just give you an example of what I imagine coming out of an IPEF process. There will be a lot of agreements to cooperate on artificial intelligence. I can promise you that that will be on the agenda.
Yeah, that's right.
That is useful. I mean, again, we would rather have you cooperate than not cooperate, but in terms of delivering actual bottom line benefits to a company in Q4, that is not going to deliver anything. So businesses will be skeptical about the importance of these conversations. There are a few things that could be done, and I was delighted actually to see when the United States asked for comments on IPEF that most of them were in the digital space. And many of them were very specific and very practical by all of the industries and industry associations that responded. They came up with, I think in many cases, some concrete examples of what could be done that would deliver for business, that might create win-win outcomes among the members. The challenge on the digital side, because I know I'm going to get this question, the challenge on the digital side is that the digital part of IPEF is embedded in a larger set of issues that are less attractive to many other members, like labor, human rights, environment, competition policy, good regulatory practices. So that is a less attractive basket overall. And when you throw digital in there, even if that becomes a compelling thing to do, you'd have to accept all of that other stuff, which is less of a win-win outcome for many of the potential members. So we'll see what happens on the digital front.
Thank you very much for your fascinating comments on climate and how that could actually be a driver. I've actually had a similar conversation much earlier in this series about how climate change and the pandemic could end up winding each other as unexpected bedfellows. So within the much broader view of trade agreements, and especially the US-driven trade agreement, it's fascinating to see how that could happen. Although the political process that you mentioned of the diamond, so to speak, the climate change incentive wrapped up in a bunch of other bureaucratic issues could be problematic.
I think so. I mean, none of this is easy, but my faith is that governments have in the past solved challenging issues, and I hope that they manage to find their way clear to do it again, because we're going to need that kind of cooperative spirit to resolve a lot of the most pressing issues. And I would say climate is one of the most pressing and the most in need of cooperation to solve it.
Yes, it's funny how these need for cooperation endeavors continue to pop up, whether it's climate or the pandemic. We're going to have to get it right.
Yeah. And cooperation solves problems. So ultimately, even if you have issues with other parties, you have to try to compartmentalize those challenges and say, we may have issues here, but we can still cooperate or have discussions there, because ultimately many of these challenges are global. And if we divide everybody up and say, I can't talk to you about anything, that's going to be really problematic. We can't solve global problems without a global consensus.
Well, agreed 100%. That's a lot of why I do what I do and have been for a long time. We used to be a vertical business and quickly realized we needed to be a horizontal business, because that's the only way our clients will solve problems and we will help them solve those problems. So thank you for that particular view. You actually raise a very interesting point. It'll be our last one. That's the most difficult, and that is the Ukrainian-Russian war and how you see that impacting any of these, particularly the 3 Asian-based trade agreements. Do you see any, it may not be happening right now, but do you see any kind of factors involved there?
At the moment, for many Asian governments, they see the Ukraine-Russia situation as quite far away. Not to say that it's not important, but it is not like get out of bed in the morning and focus on that first thing. So it matters, but it's a sort of distant rumble of challenge. Where it becomes more of an issue for this region is sort of two things in particular. First is the relationship between Russia and China. Now that makes a big difference here in Asia. If we see China's increasing closeness with Russia, then that will make it more difficult for many governments to continue to work with China. So there's sort of an indirect effect through the China-Russia connection. So that's one area. And then a second area, although again, this is a bit less relevant, but can matter, the disruption in our institutions that we have in place to manage problems is a real issue. So, you know, the World Trade Organization is due to meet this next month, and that could be disrupted by Russia's presence. We could not get a statement at the last APEC meeting, 21 members across the region, including Russia, China, the US in APEC, and they could not agree on a statement. The G20, which is being handled by Indonesia, is also similarly at risk of difficulties because the same members are also members in the G20. And so I think where you do see a connection between Russia, Ukraine, and policy in this region is a paralyzing effect on many of the infrastructures we need to solve problems. And if that continues for too long, then that becomes a problem that does occupy Asian officials as they get out of bed most mornings.
Yeah, and it almost has, although kind of an insidious in the backdrop, kind of a polarizing effect at some level. You know, we talked about the anti-China nature of the free trade agreement from the US, and then we talked about China being a part of, you know, already in one of the big 3 agreements and applying to the other 2. And so I think this, from what you're saying, can have a polarizing effect over time.
I think it becomes a real challenge, and it has driven policy in different ways. You know, the Europeans, as you might imagine, of course, consumed with Russia, Ukraine, and that has led to different kinds of policies by the Europeans. It's obviously led to some challenging policies by the United States. And I think the longer it goes on, the more you're going to have to take sides and the more challenging it will be to remain neutral. For many governments in Asia, they would, I think, prefer to remain relatively neutral on Russia, Ukraine, because they see this again as quite far away, and as for many, a precedent that is problematic because they are very jealous of their own sovereignty and they don't want to be told what to do and they don't want to tell others what to do, sort of by extension. The longer it goes on, though, the harder it is to remain neutral, the harder it is to stay integrated, the harder it is to cooperate. I think that is a challenge, even if you would prefer to not have this problem on your agenda.
Yes, it's so interesting in light of the previous topic where we talked about the unification necessary to solve many problems. And then I hear you talking about this polarization and on the front burner and the back burner kind of effect. And then I think about what Ian Bremmer just said. He was talking about some trends recently, as you know, of the Eurasia Group. And he sees, at least in this particular piece, it could have changed, Russia permanently disenfranchising themselves from the West. And I noticed he didn't mention the East, but I have to say, appearances suggest in terms of Europe and the US, let's just consider that the West for the moment, it certainly looks like a fairly permanent move. And so neutrality may not be possible in the East, I don't know.
It may be an issue. I think one thing that is important, remember that economics drives policy in
Right.
Asia, and the economic links between Asia and Russia still is very modest. So, which is partly, again, why for many Asian governments, this issue is less relevant. They're not as keen on discussing human rights or conflict in general, violations of sovereignty, like all of those things that matter so much to many Western governments matter less in Asia because it's really economics first. And since there are limited ties between Russia and most of Asia, it feels like a conflict that can simply be put to the side for much of the day. And occasionally, you know, it pops up and you have to pay attention, especially for these institutional settings where, again, it's not generally Asian governments that are standing up and walking out of particular
Right.
statements or meetings. They tend to be like, you know, if you watch the video, many of these officials are sort of looking like, can I just duck under this desk so that nobody notices? Because I don't want to get up and leave, but I don't really want to just sit here either. So, you know, like, could the floor open up underneath me? And then, you know, when this is resolved and I come back to my chair without me having to make a choice one way or the other. I think that's what many governments would prefer in this particular context. But I think that becomes untenable. You can't sort of be ducking under the desk every time that an issue comes up.
No, I mean, this is so, you know, we started talking about the pandemic as unprecedented, and certainly it has been. And then I think in a lot of ways, this geopolitical situation is unprecedented because the original forecast was it would be over in 3 days, which was on the narcissistic side of things. But, you know, here we are 3-4 months in, and it doesn't look over anytime soon. So that's, again, unprecedented in a different way about how to respond. You know, how do you even respond? Yeah. Well,
I think it hits
at
a time when we have these institutions that were under stress. So if we had stronger institutions and stronger cooperative mechanisms that were functioning efficiently and effectively like they may have in the past, this may have been less of a challenge. But because those institutions were under stress, it doesn't take much to break them. And I think this could be the part of what breaks them between COVID, you know, Russia, Ukraine. We have a number of unprecedented issues that are really pressing stress on our ability as a planet to manage many of the key issues that will determine our future.
I guess I hear you and I agree with you. Thank you for articulating that so well. I guess the most lamentable thing is, of the two of many unprecedented scenarios we have now, one of them could have been contained. You know, nobody could really have stopped the pandemic, although I suppose there's an argument somewhere from a bacteriologist that could say something about that. That was fairly inevitable, unfortunately, but the current situation could be stopped if particular individuals chose to do so. And I guess that's a little bit harder for me personally to swallow because of the damage it's done, but we're going to learn what we're going to learn, right?
Unfortunately, yeah.
Well, I have to say I have optimism from your region leading in a way, because these free trade agreements are the only solace of, you know, a verisimilitude of unification, even if it's economically driven. You know, that's part of why I do what I do, because I think economics do drive a lot of unification. and platform building. So that gives me hope. I hope it's not delusional.
I remain optimistic, largely optimistic about Asia's future. Despite a lot of challenges and a lot of pressures, I think that that integration impulse is important. And if they can keep the flame of cooperation alive in the region, I think that that benefits everyone.
Terrific. Well, Deborah, it's always great to speak with you. Thanks for sharing your wealth of information. And I encourage anyone interested in these topics to follow Deborah and her company. The following slide will show the email for her, but more importantly, the URL, because the content that you prolifically create is such a high caliber and really keeps people informed. But it's always great to speak with you, Deborah. Thanks so much for your time and expertise.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Look forward to speaking with you next time. If you're interested in global business expertise or going to market globally, we're here to support you. Please feel free to contact me on the following slide as well. Thank you, and thanks again, Deborah. Bye-bye.